You're listening to Two Broads Talking Politics, part of the Demcast Podcast Network.
Are you listening?
Hey everyone, this is Kelly with Two Broads Talking Politics, part of the Demcast Podcast Network. And I am actually sitting here in person, a rare treat for me, with Ryan Bernsten, who is the host of the 50 States of Mind podcast and has a super interesting and exciting journey to tell us about. So hi, Ryan.
Hi, Kelly. Thanks for having me here on the beautiful, very safe U Chicago campus.
Yes.
Hyde Park is beautiful at this time of year. It's a real treat to be here.
Yes, I have fallen in love with Hyde Park, I will admit, but I haven't been nearly as many places in the country as you have. So let's jump into that a little bit. Tell me a little bit about just your background and this amazing journey that you took.
Yes. So like all good things in life, this trip was a complete surprise. I think it was sort of me asking myself, what are all the things I love? This trip started as my graduate thesis at the University of Oxford. And I kind of looked at my past, and I had studied writing at Northwestern University. I had worked on the Hillary Clinton campaign, and I had a real love of travel. And so when it came time to do a master's thesis, I was like, how can I combine all the things that I love? And I'd been to 48 states, and I was like, if I could do the last 2 states as part of this trip, and if I could sort of talk to people about politics and sort of in this post-2016 world, try to figure out what's going on with democracy, I think it would be something that would keep me occupied for the whole year. And it has kept me occupied for the whole year and beyond. I have submitted the final thesis, and I've started writing a book, and it's been a year, and it's lasting me at least this long and beyond. So it's been really something that has consumed my entire life.
So you went to all 50 states as part of this trip and talked to how many people in each state?
So the goal was to go to at least 3 places in each state. And that means a biggish city, smallish town, and a tiny village. In writing the book, I can't include everything for narrative purposes, but for the podcast, I can take these interviews that I recorded and I can put them in the podcast to be discussed. So I would say I talked to at least probably 300 people over the course of the journey, and some were very diligently planned, sending emails to mayors and governors and getting connected. And some were just pure crazy chance, walking into the Capitol building in Tennessee and ending up at the inauguration party with the entire Congressional Black Caucus was a situation like that, where it was just sheer dumb luck.
Yeah, that's amazing. So how logistically do you even go about doing something like that? So I will tell you that I was in a doctoral program for a few years, didn't finish it. And part of what my stumbling block was, I was going to write this dissertation about the Appalachian Trail, and I was going to hike the Appalachian Trail and interview people. This was nearly 20 years ago now. Technology wasn't as good. I didn't have this cute little Zoom that I have here that I could record things on. But just the sheer logistics of it got in my way, and I couldn't move past it. How do you plan something like this?
That's a big thing that I had to deal with. You know, you send out corporate sponsorship emails because, you know, the school can only cover so much and you get denied from some school scholarships. And at a certain point, I had to say to myself, I don't know if I'm going to be able to pay for this. I don't know if this is going to work out. I don't know if I'm going to have places to stay, but I need to move forward and hope a net will appear and sort of take that leap of faith. So I started the trip. I didn't have a car. I didn't have funding. I didn't have places to stay beyond the first 3 states. So it was completely insane of me to do it, really. I posted a Facebook status about the trip, basically saying, hey, I need your help. If you know anyone that can host me on a couch that lives in, you know, the states that I probably wouldn't know anyone in, such as Kansas, just connect me, please. And I think starting like that, and not starting as a Nabisco spokesperson and going around passing around Ritz bits to every person, sort of made it about this sort of grassroots generosity of American democracy, because people came out of the woodwork to host me, to connect me with people. And these weren't just people that I knew from the Hillary Clinton campaign or people that I knew from college. It was people who I knew from random chance encounters around the country, someone I'd meet at a bar. And so the people I was staying with, this isn't a scientific distribution of left and right and different classes, but it sort of became this really nice, varied pool of people with different political beliefs, different regional backgrounds, different education backgrounds. So I was staying on people's couches in a garage sometimes. Sometimes I was staying with college students. Sometimes I was staying with people on a dude ranch. And so it was a really interesting sampling of different perspectives in America. And I think looking back now, I wouldn't have had it any other way.
Yeah, that's crazy. So I have so many questions. So geographically, where did you start? Did you sort of jump all over the place? Did you go in sort of a nice straightish line? Like what did you do?
There's no such thing as a straightish line when traveling, but I decided to start in Ohio. I sort of thought that was sort of the heart of America. You know,
that's what Ohio likes to think. I'm from Ohio, so
wait, which part?
Near Canton.
Okay, nice. Yeah. I didn't go there, but I loved Cleveland and Gambier and Worthington. But I thought they'd picked the presidential winner every single year since 1960 or something like that. And I feel like they have a really strong pulse of the country. And they're sort of mid-region. They're sort of Midwest, but also sort of East Coast. And it's sort of a state that a lot of people internationally have their eyes on. So I started there, and it completely started me on the right path. I ended up in places that I never would have thought possible. I ended up interviewing the mayor of Gambier, who is formerly a Chicago lawyer, who moved to the middle of the country on sort of a leap of faith when her husband got a job at Kenyon College. And now she's the mayor, the only progressive in the office of mostly Trump supporters. And in a very, very red county, she was able to talk to me, my first interview, about how people can have conversations about issues that affect all of them without bringing in the culture war or partisan politics. So that was just sheer dumb luck. And I sort of was like, I don't need to talk to anyone else now. You've kind of articulated exactly what I'm trying to do. And I also ended up at Skeet's Bar, which is in East Cleveland in a pretty high crime neighborhood. And I was the only white guy at this bar. And I was able to have conversations with people about what that bar means in a neighborhood that is so impacted by violence. And the thought process that you don't know what tomorrow is going to bring when there's so much violence in the neighborhood. I know that we can think that on a national level with all the mass shootings, that does something to our psyche and that does something to the way we think about things. But if it's concentrated in your community, that's going to have a huge impact. But being able to talk to people about the generosity that they show each other, because tomorrow isn't guaranteed. I mean, I talked to a bartender that cooks for people on holidays, that always has food for someone who, if they come in and they're having a bad day, they can have it. And, that sort of sense of belonging that we're all looking for is also something that I was really interested in with this project. How do you feel a part of community? How do you feel a part of our democracy? And sort of that idea of how do you have a civil conversation about politics on one hand, but also how do you feel a part of where you are and feel essential to your community were sort of the two questions I wanted to tackle. So started me off on the right foot in Ohio, and I'm always grateful to Ohio for that. And then I sort of started with level one, which was the East Coast, because I thought I'd have the warmest reception with my history working for Democratic campaigns. But my preconceived notions about the East Coast were completely flipped too, because at the time, I was there before the 2018 midterm elections and during the 2018 midterm elections. Every single state I visited, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, Massachusetts, had Republican governors. And that's not really what people think when they think of the East Coast. And so asking the questions, why is it like this? And what are the nuances of our preconceived notions about the different regions? So I feel like I got started off on the right foot, and then I sort of clumped, and the book is organized this way as well, into different regions. And sometimes it's hard to categorize a region. I really struggled to categorize part of the trip that I've called the Rust Belt. What is the Rust Belt? I'm from Rockford, Illinois, which is very much a Rust Belt town. And it's very difficult to categorize what Rust Belt means because it's kind of a new term. It came up in 1984. Walter Mondale said that Reagan's policies were turning the Midwest into a bowl of rust or something. And the media was like, there's a better way to say that, Rust Belt. And so I went to all these places in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, but also Kentucky, also Indiana, and also West Virginia. And my whole Rust radar was, does this feel like Rockford? Does this feel like a community that's had to undergo some major changes, either with factories moving out or jobs changing or leaving? And one of my favorite stories from that was actually going to West Virginia, which everyone thinks, coal country, every county voted against Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election and actually in the primary. Everyone voted for Bernie as well. But going to a town where a job creating, I put that in quotes, factory is moving in, Rockwool in Shepherdstown in Jefferson County on the eastern side of West Virginia. And the entire town, 80% of the town, 12,000 people come together across all kinds of partisan lines, economic strata to protest the building of this factory directly across the street from a low-income elementary school. So we're talking two 210-foot smokestacks. The entire community is like, we don't care how many jobs this is going to create. And fun fact, only 120. But it's not worth what's going to happen to our air, our water, our tourism, and our kids directly across the street. And not to mention in a neighborhood of some of the poorest people in the entire county. You go around the entire county and you see big signs, stop Rockwool, toxic Rockwool. And then you drive around this low-income neighborhood, not a single sign, because they've probably been bought off a little bit. So things like that, overcoming the preconceived notions of West Virginia. It's not a place that's anti-environmental. There's a lot of grassroots excitement. But I would not have known that if I hadn't gone. You got to know to go.
Yeah.
Got to go to know. I guess both.
So, one question I have as I'm sitting here thinking as a woman and as a very liberal woman, I would feel like I might be unsafe in places. Did you ever feel unsafe? Were there things that worried you a little bit about doing this journey, about staying on strangers' couches? And
I definitely have to acknowledge my privilege. I'm a white, pretty average, brown-haired dude, and I'm pretty able to blend in. And I'm also very agreeable, and I can keep my opinions to myself when I need to in order to have the trip feel safe. And besides one time in a small town in New Mexico called Truth or Consequences, where someone did yell a slur at me and chase me around in a pickup truck. But I think that could have been because of the history of the town as a town full of accomplices of serial killers. Look up David Parker Ray if you want more information on that. But I actually felt pretty safe, and that was an outlier. And I think it was because I really wasn't there to stir the pot. I wasn't there to educate people. I was there to get my own education and then synthesize it into something else later on. And I think the most in danger I ever was actually is I went undercover to a Trump rally and I got found out that I was an employee for the Hillary Clinton campaign, because this group of people that I'd really befriended and found some common ground on, AKA the corporate media is bad for America.
Yeah.
We went off on that for a while. I was like, I didn't really expect that we'd have something to agree on. They asked my name, and I thought instead of giving a fake name, they should have my real name. They looked me up on Facebook. And the most recent place I worked, because I haven't changed it, been in grad school, was Hillary for America. And the big cover photo was me with Hillary. So they look at me, they're like, what? You're dressed, you're here, you're a liberal in disguise. And I had to admit what I was doing and admit that I felt unsafe being there, as I truly was. And they completely embraced me and thought it was awesome that I was there and wanted to give me an education, because I don't think they ever had someone come in sort of in good faith to want to hear their perspective. I mean, afterwards, I still obviously have a lot of issues with the whole Trump movement, and I'm not a MAGA guy, but it was a new perspective that I could sort of use to overcome my preconceived notions, but also fill in the blanks of my little bubble of Hillary supporters, because on the campaign, we didn't talk to Republicans. We didn't have to do these persuasion calls. We didn't have to talk to the people that weren't in our universe. And when we did, and someone said that they were not voting for Hillary or not interested, cross them off the list. They're done. So I think that's a time that I felt unsafe momentarily, but again, the real theme of this entire trip, along with that leap of faith idea, is just the goodness of people. People came out of the woodwork to help me. People surprised me. People were great. And at the end of the day, it was the American people that got me through this trip. It wasn't a big corporation. It wasn't some sort of sponsor. And actually, the funding for the trip primarily came from universities that said, hey, we'd love to bring you in to do a talk with some of our students along the way and talk about these things that are very relevant to their lives right now. And one thing that I've sort of taken away from the trip was I'd been living in New York. I went to Northwestern. I'd lived in LA. I realized that the number, especially of college grads, undergrads, that moves to the big cities is hugely disproportionate. Most people go to Chicago, DC, New York, LA. And I had to kind of look at myself and say, where am I in this? Where does my vote count? But not only where does my vote count, but where do my talents matter? And so this trip ended up leading me to Kansas City, Missouri. And that's where I live now, because I fell in love with it on the trip, but also because if I articulated these ideas that, we've got to, go back and live alongside people with different opinions to understand them and become a part of a community in a place that's sort of the right size to make an impact. If I had done this trip and then moved to New York, I think it would feel a little hypocritical, but I've got to admit, it's really tough for me to be in Chicago right now because it is my favorite city in America. And I'm just like, gosh, I wish I lived here.
Yes, I could not leave Chicago. So I'm impressed that you can live anywhere else.
Once you have roots here, I think it's tough to take them out. But luckily, my parents live not too far from here. So it still feels pretty much in my backyard. But gosh, best city in America.
Yeah. Were people surprised that you were coming to talk to them? Were there people that were like, who the heck wants to talk to people in our town?
Yeah, actually. And that's kind of the really endearing thing about it. If you say you're going to write a book, people are all of a sudden very interested. Mm. I think if I was just sort of like, I'm just a dude that wants to know what you think, people would be like, get away from me. But it was really flattering for some people, I think. I interviewed a guy fishing off a dock in Erie, Pennsylvania. He's just like, I may not be the most well-spoken person in the world. I don't know why you'd want to hear from me. I work 50 hours a week roofing. And I think it's important that these perspectives are heard because they exist. And even if you don't agree with it, it's always going to exist unless you do something to take that perspective, learn about it, and then say, hey, here's an alternative perspective. Have you thought about it this way? And I had quite a few of those conversations where I thought we were talking about something completely different or on the opposite side of an issue. And either they came my way or I went their way. Or we realized we were talking about the same thing. And I stayed with quite a few Trump supporters on this trip who do a lot of volunteer work in the community with, I can think of an example in Alabama with African refugees. She devotes her entire life through Catholic Family Charities, helping a refugee family that lived in a camp in Tanzania for 20 years integrate into the Mobile community. And she did this because she was a victim of Hurricane Katrina and she lost her home. And she said, what can I do in my community to make a difference? And I think extracting the conversation between how you vote and what you do and looking at those two things separately, I think is important because you can change how someone votes if you talk to them, but you also have to not demonize them as an entire person. If they're doing good work in the community, if I voted the way I think is right, but I don't do any of that good work, does the value add up? And I think that's something that's been forgotten. And I think that's why community involvement, I could actually argue this for a really long time, but I'll keep it short. Community involvement is not only good for your community and good to meet people from a truly intersectional background. People do all kinds of volunteer work for different reasons. They can do it because they were formerly homeless. They can do it because their child just moved away to college and they're really bored. That's the way you meet people from different backgrounds. And I would argue that it's actually the best way to lead a fulfilled life. We have a lot of anxiety and alienation in this culture, and that's something I heard a lot from people of all ages. I think it's mostly because of social media and because of our insane corporate media culture. But the people that got involved and got out in their community and met people and did things were just happier people and were less outraged about everything because they felt like they had agency over their little slice of the country or big slice of the country. And the problems that they were faced with on the news every day didn't feel as defeating because they were actually doing something about it. And that was the big takeaway. When I started this trip, I was like, what's the book about? I was like, I don't really know. I think it could be politics. I think it could be volunteering. It could just be about people. It could be a Humans of New York thing. But now that I've written the book and done the podcast, I realize it's about democracy and belonging. How can you have a conversation with someone in your democracy when you don't feel like they belong or you don't feel like you belong? We've got to find a way to make everyone in our community feel like they belong. And once we're a part of the same team, we can have these difficult conversations that we can't have on Facebook, really, and we can't really have through sharing articles or the news media. You've got to trust that the other person is your neighbor and treat them as such, and try to understand why they believe what they believe, and not be afraid in person to tell someone when you think they're wrong or why, because not everyone has the privilege of education. And that's the problem. In the situation we have, a lot of people get information from a lot of places that may or may not be actually true. You were talking about this on the Demcast episode. It's really important to understand that not everyone has the privilege of knowing everything in the world. And if you do know something, you got to share that information or try to break down someone's defenses a little bit. Because if you're told you're stupid, and if I came to this podcast and like, you really don't know what you're talking about, you get your back up a little bit. That's just how people work. And treating people with neighborliness or love. I hate to get all Mr. Rogers here, but it's really important. And the longer we hold off on that, I think the worse things are going to get. So it's not even about, okay, the Democrats are going to win in 2020. Well, the Republicans are going to go plot the way to get back, and they're going to use worse and worse tactics. And that doesn't mean on a policy level that we have to sacrifice our values, but it's a way to say, hey, I trust that you have the best interest of the country here. And okay, maybe you have the best interest of your corporate donors here, but how can we talk about what's really going on? And how can we find a way that everybody wins? And I just don't think anyone's really approached the conversation from that angle. And nothing else is working, so why not try? And there are a lot of people that think, you're being a moderate or you're apologizing for people. And I'm like, actually, I have really strong beliefs, and I think I'm probably pretty on the progressive side of things. But, I'm not just going to change anything by being a progressive and talking to other progressives. You've got to show people what they're missing out on or what they don't know, because I didn't know everything when I started this trip. And now I feel like I've had an education because I've actually listened to people instead of talking. And now I can talk.
Were there any politicians that you interviewed or in any communities that you think are doing this sort of thing well? I mean, you mentioned that first mayor that you talked to who was able to talk to other people in the community. But, do we have models for this kind of thing and how we can really make that work?
Yeah, I'm going to go against something I just said, saying all social media is bad. There is a town in Wisconsin, Appleton, Wisconsin, where they're doing something pretty amazing with social media. I talked to Mayor Tim Hanna, who has been in office since 1996. That's a popular mayor right there. I talked to him. He's talking about how we need diversity initiatives in Wisconsin towns. He wants to go out and start talking to other towns as well. He's trying to create a forum for people to have conversations about big national issues with respect and have a dialogue. And especially because his county went for Trump by about 14 points. And then I find out, oh my gosh, the guy's a Republican. I just assumed he was a Democrat based on what he was saying because I liked it so much. But they do this thing called What's Your Question Wednesday on their Facebook group. And basically Appleton City Hall every Wednesday will say, all right, it's time for What's Your Question Wednesday. And people will say, when is my pothole getting fixed? And the city government will respond. Or what's up with this change speed limit? Or what time does school get out on Labor Day? Or, I mean, Labor Day is a holiday, but things like that. But also people ask ridiculous questions like, why do people like Attack of the Clones? And the government, whoever the faceless person is, will come back with memes and GIFs. What do you say? GIFs?
I say GIFs.
I say GIFs too. And it sort of has this good feeling, and people will rant. And then the city government will say, do you know what? You're right. Let's find a way to fix this. And I think people feel often that their government is just this thing that doesn't listen to them. And often they're right. But it's amazing to see Appleton, Wisconsin make for one time a week their government listen and respond. I think, we've all sat on the phone with some government agency where it's just like you're on a waiting line and there's music and it's 30 minutes. But it's just nice to have that feeling that the government's actually accountable. So I think that's one of my favorite examples. I'm trying to think of former Governor Christine Todd Whitman of New Jersey. She's a Republican, was the EPA chief under George W. Bush. She's working a lot with the Problem Solvers Caucus. She's a pretty big voice against Trump, but talking about how you can get this caucus in Congress that is bipartisan and focused on let's just solve the problem. Let's not fall to the noise. But one thing she pointed out is that's not very sexy. Yeah. We like the problems. We don't like the solving of the problems. And, talking about the way the media has fallen into the hands of 6, soon to be 4 companies. They want us to be outraged and they don't want to talk about solving problems. And it really falls down to us. Our democracy is the product of the way we vote, the way we live, where we live. And if we don't think that problem solving is sexy, we're going to reap the benefits. Not benefits. I guess benefits because it's very entertaining, but we're going to reap what we sow in that case. Yeah. And I'm trying to think of some other towns that I should give a nice little shout out to. I mean, Greenville, South Carolina is an amazing town. Another mayor who is a Republican who's been in office forever, and what they've done to bring a real international community and bring companies into Greenville has made it a model for a lot of other towns as well. Their model is, okay, if you have local owned stores downtown, if you have cute little cafes, you have cute little restaurants, cute ice cream stores, people are going to want to live above that thing. So now you're going to have less traffic downtown. People are going to be walking around supporting those businesses. And then businesses, big companies are going to come in and say, oh, this is really cute. This is really cute. We should get some people in here. And people are taking notice. I was in Milledgeville, Georgia, which is famous for having one of the largest psychiatric campuses in Georgia. It was closed in the 70s, and that basically sent their entire town reeling because it was the major business in the town. They're looking at Greenville and they're saying, how can we get things here in this town that people feel a part of tradition? So this man that I was talking to is one of the economic advisors of the town, dresses up as the guy from the Polar Express, and they do a trolley all around downtown with the kids around Christmas time. And it's just like, people are trying. And his whole thing is, my grandfather lived here, my dad lived here, I live here. I want my kids to live here. And people take a lot of pride in their town. And I think when people feel overlooked or that the good things in their town aren't being covered by the media, I think they get a little mad.
So obviously not everybody can go on one of these 50-state trips.
Takes a lot of gas.
I'm
you have to like to drive.
I do not like driving at all. And I'm imagining taking my 2 kids along. But what are there ways we can sort of experience small bits of that? Are there places you would recommend people go, things they do that'll sort of help them get that sense of things without having to go to all 50 states?
So I don't think you have to go to all 50 states at a time to get that idea. And I think we have really popular destinations for vacations in America. I think we like to, go to New York, go to Disney, go to even Austin, Texas. I think it's really important for us to not do repeat vacations. I mean, sure, fine, you do repeat vacations if you need to, but we have some really amazing places and places that you wouldn't even expect. And the weirdest things. For example, I talk about my trip to Casper, Wyoming. It's a place I almost moved and I fell so in love with it. If you told me that a year ago, I would think that you were absolutely crazy, but you just don't know till you go. And, for all of the legacy of anti-LGBT violence in Wyoming because of what happened in Laramie, one of the biggest economic movers and shakers in the town is Amber, and she owns the Backwoods Distillery. When I was there, they were sort of out of the city, and now it's gotten so popular that they're in the city. And Amber lives with her wife in Casper, Wyoming, and they meet with the governor. They're such big economic movers and shakers that they are able to kind of dictate the terms of the town, even if people have an issue with their lifestyle. And I wouldn't have known that if I wouldn't have gone. If you have the means to do that, I would say go. But I actually think that everyone should have the means to do that if you have a car and you're going to places that aren't expensive. If you have the means to go to New York, you have the means to go to these other places.
Yeah.
And you're going to deal with less traffic. You're going to have more interesting conversations because you're going to be interesting. You're going to be someone that they're like, who the heck is this new person in town? And someone's going to talk to you and you're going to have a real conversation where you can kind of change another person and maybe they'll change you too. The thing I always need to pitch for those people who can do that is, live somewhere else for a bit. If you work remotely or if you have an opportunity to go to a different place for work, why not try out somewhere else just for a little bit? You could hate it, but you can always go back. And especially, I don't want to make the argument that in 2020, everyone should move to Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, because I would feel like I'm being a little one-sided. But, if you really care and you really have the means, why not try out Appleton for a little bit? Why not try out East Lansing, Michigan? It's there's some really nice places, and the places I thought that I was going to sort of be fine with and move on from, I loved. Hot Springs, Arkansas, an incredible place. Obviously, New Orleans is amazing. Anchorage, Alaska, Shepherdstown, West Virginia, Casper, Wyoming, Bend, Oregon, Salt Lake City. Oh my gosh. Victor, Idaho. There are just all these really fantastic places that I just hadn't heard of or didn't know about. And Louisville, Kentucky. Am I saying that right? People always have different ways of saying it. Kansas City, Missouri is obviously my big thing. The general Kansas side of Kansas City is amazing. Omaha, Nebraska. Oh my gosh. Fergus Falls, Minnesota. Fargo, North Dakota. Great Falls, Montana. Had the spiciest hamburger there I've ever had in my whole life. Hung out with a bunch of people on an oil rig the day after, and that was pretty rough for me. There's just a really great variety of things in our country, and it would be a real shame. I think going over to England had something to do with this. I was like, I'm living in another country. I barely know my own. I should probably change that. I should probably get to know some of the hidden secrets and hidden pockets of America, and I really think I'm better for it.
As someone who nearly 100% of my vacations at this point are in Canton, Ohio, maybe I need to start going some other places. We did an episode last year about the politics of Wyoming and interviewed, because there are so few Democrats in Wyoming. We interviewed the person running for governor and the person running for Senate. And, I think we came to the conclusion that it wouldn't be that hard to tip the scales in Wyoming if, a whole bunch of us moved there. There's only 500,000 people in the whole state.
Yeah. If you want to go start a little Democratic cults, it's not something that I haven't not thought about. And actually they're really, I'm not sure if you talked to the mayor of Cheyenne, Marion Orr. She's a Democrat and she's doing really exciting, cool things. It is possible to tip the scale. But the thing I need to say is it can't be a hostage takeover. They talk about Californians coming in and sort of co-opting spaces, and they come for the summer and then they leave. It really puts a bad taste in people's mouth when they just sort of come for an election or a nice season and they don't want to get involved with the community. That is the heart of the problem in America right now. People in places that aren't super nice, I think, feel like people elsewhere look down on them, don't want to get to know them, don't want to see their way of life. And, I had my preconceived notions about Wyoming, but there's a real, they say it's like the 1950s and maybe in more ways than one, but in the way that you leave your door unlocked, you bring cookies over to your neighbor. And I think a lot of people are kind of craving that sort of, trust in their neighbors, but in an inclusive way. And I think that's the important things. If we could have an inclusive 1950s, I think that'd be a pretty interesting model for what we're going for, because obviously the 1950s weren't too inclusive. And yeah.
So tell people how they can listen to your podcast.
Oh gosh. Yeah, of course. So my podcast, 50 States of Mind, 50 States of Mind, is on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, wherever people can listen to podcasts.
Are found.
Yeah, that's what I say these days. And I am excited about the podcast because this idea of overcoming preconceived notions in America, when I was over at Oxford, I took people from all 7 continents, classmates and friends and colleagues of mine, and I had them listen to interviews with people in Ohio, Vermont, Pennsylvania, and their takeaways were really surprising to me. Their ideas of America versus what I knew were startling. For example, pretty much everyone I talked to thought there were 52 states. I was like, 50 states of mind. They're like, that's so cool. Why did you – does it just sound better to not have two? I'm like, no, there are 50 states. Like, oh, we didn't know that. So just starting from the basics and going down to the discussions that you can have about things that are really hot button, like abortion, and things that are really personal, like religion, and things that are really trivial, like, you know, a bunch of old people in Vermont sitting around talking about being in a group of senior dancers doing line dancing. But the discussions that come out of that when you actually have a discussion are, I think, really interesting and exciting. And hopefully we'll help people see the world a little differently and be curious about America. But I also kind of trick people into learning about other countries as well, as you do.
You need to have next a kids version where you talk to kids about what they think about each state. My kids still have trouble, I think, distinguishing cities from states.
Okay.
And so, so we go to Ohio a lot. My brother lives in Cincinnati. My parents live in Canton. And, you know, my kids will say like, oh, we're going to be in Cincinnati and then we're going to Ohio. It's like, well, Cincinnati's in Ohio, guys. So, you know, what kids think about different parts of the country. And, you know, my kids are growing up so differently than I did. And the middle of nowhere, Ohio. You know, they're in a big city all the time, and just the sort of their conceptions of what the world is, you know, it's very different than how I grew up, but it's very interesting.
Sounds like a good idea for Demcast.
Anyone out there wants to start a podcast, join the network.
Yeah, that's it's fascinating. It's just amazing what we can learn from each other because we all have holes in our education, whether we're 9 years old or 29 years old or 39.
Yeah. And now you're working on the book.
Working on the book.
What's the plan with that?
Working with an Asian and over in the UK and recently redrafting and making sure that it's all looking good for the submission for Oxford in 3 days.
Wow.
Yeah, so this is a study break for me. And just making sure that when you're dealing with something so sensitive, politics and people's stories, you want to make sure you get it exactly right. So I want to get it out hopefully next summer in time for the 2020 election. But I want to make sure that I do it right because, you know, we live in a culture where even something taken out of context can seem really startling. And part of the book is about my own education. And I can think something at one point. And the point of a book is to show the